This is Paul. I wanted to share with you some of a channel I discovered. I've been watching bloggingheads.com or .tv for a while, and those of you who know, follow me on Twitter, know that I really enjoy Glenn Loury and John McWhorter and their commentary on race. I find them both to be honest and intelligent, and obviously race relations have been a big part of my life, growing up in Patterson as I did with my father. And Robert Wright is also on that channel. I've listened to some things from him. He does some interesting interviews with people. And then he has this meaningoflife.tv channel too that he has. And I noticed that he did an interview with Glenn Loury. And I didn't know much about Glenn Loury's past. And I very much recommend the entire interview. It takes about an hour. But Loury was transparent, honest, straightforward, candid. Everything, just told the story of his life, and it's quite a story. The ups and downs, the tragedies, his own flaws, his own struggles with things, and he like many African Americans grew up going to church, but then left the church and came back to the church when he, in the process of gaining sobriety, and then he tells this story, and I was just so deeply moved by this entire
African Methodist Episcopal, but it had this particular ministry, a Pentecostal flavor to it. It was friendly to Pentecostalism, and believed, that the promises that are made in the Bible, in the book of Acts, about baptism in the Holy Spirit and the powers and enlightenment and expansion of your spiritual capacity that would come with that, believe that literally. As I said, prayed for healing and expected an answer, and so on. And I found myself very happily ensconced for quite a few years, I'd say 8 or 10 years, in that posture. But at the back of my mind, there were always these nagging doubts, and I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe this is another one of the things I need to explore very carefully. I mean, there was a particular incident, a woman who had worked for me for about 5 or 6 years, and then a young woman, and she'd been my administrative assistant at a small institute that I was running at Boston University, where I was on the faculty at that time. Her dream her name was Sherry DuPont, and Sherry's dream had always been to go to law school. She was an African-American woman in her 30s who'd had somewhat of a checkered college career, but had managed to complete her studies from Trinity University in Hartford, Connecticut, and come to work for me in her 30s. She'd always wanted to go to law school, and finally we passed the hat up and down the hallway of our little offices to raise money for her LSAT prep test, and she got herself admitted to Boston University Law School. She aced the first year, brilliantly made law review, but contracted a viral infection of the heart, and by September of what would have been her second year in law school, she was dead. She died. She was on the waiting list for a heart transplant, and the next thing I knew, she had expired. So that was Sherry, and I loved this woman as one might love a good friend, and was just devastated by her death. And our church had the funeral because she happened to have been a member of the church. Now, the funeral was this celebration of the fact that she was going to live forever. God loved her so much that he took her unto himself at that early age. We had come not to mourn the death, but to celebrate the everlasting life of Sherry DuPont. And people were dancing joyously around that sanctuary. Her own mother told me to my face that I should not mourn her death, that it was okay. She was now with the Lord. And I have to tell you, Bob, I found that posture and that ceremony preposterous and cowardly. Because my thought was that, this is a tragedy beyond imagining. Don't tell me that this is a part of God's plan. Don't try to make this okay. Don't try to make this a joyous occasion. Can we simply grieve her death? Can we look down into the abyss of meaningless suffering and loss and simply contemplate the nature of our human condition. It's not that easy. They're not answers for everything. Don't try to make me think that this was okay. I found myself digging out my old Friedrich Nietzsche's anti-Christian rants that I had read as a college student and rereading it to try to figure out what the heck was wrong with these cowardly Christians who couldn't acknowledge that life was full of loss of this kind for which there would be no easy answer. And it was like a catalyst that reignited the intellectual doubts that I had been carrying all along, because I don't believe in magic. I'm saying to myself, as an MIT trained, PhD and so forth and so on, give me reasons. I don't believe in magic. I was good friends with the late Richard John Newhouse, the theologian and public intellectual. We had become good friends during my years as a neoconservative, and we remained friends even after I moved a little bit away from that political orientation. And I got on a plane in Boston and flew down to New York and sat up in his rooms in Lower Manhattan and drank a half a bottle of scotch with him and contemplated my doubt. I mean, I was going to him for answers. I said, Richard, I can't believe anymore. And he laughed in my face. He said, you thought this was going to be easy? You thought believing was going to be easy? Mm-hmm. He says, there's doubt inside of belief, and there's belief inside of the doubt that's inside of that belief. This is not easy. And then he reminded me of what Christ said on his way to the, crucifixion, that if this burden could be lifted from him, et cetera. And probably quoted Aquinas or something, as, Richard would have been inclined to do, but I don't remember the exact chapter and verse on that. Just to say, I experienced it as a real traumatic crisis. I just couldn't find my faith anymore. And to be honest with you, I haven't found it since.
Wow.
And I'm just moved by that story, and I'm just moved by that story. I know churches do that sometimes, and it's a way to grieve. Not all churches do that. And I'm in some ways inclined to side with Glenn Loury in that, in terms of it's not my tradition at the tragic loss to not grieve, to not lament, to not be able to come to God and ask why and protest this death. And live in the space where we don't have answers for it. As a pastor, tragedies come, and as a pastor, you're there in those tragedies, and people will say why, as if I can give a reason, and as if I can see the mind of God, as if I can somehow justify what happens now on the basis of some good that comes. I often can't do that. It also doesn't mean that there can't be any good that comes, or it's just math I'm simply unable to do. And Loury continues on, and really, again, I'm going to watch more. I'm going to watch more from this channel, and I'm going to watch the whole interview. I haven't seen many conversations as open and honest and frank. And for many of you, I always get notes from you that, well, I'm surprised you're a pastor, because you should be what? Trying to lie, trying to say things that aren't. These are two men having a very honest conversation about what they think and how they feel, and I think that's an important and a blessed thing. There's nothing wrong with honesty.
But it had
Oops,
this
wrong one.
particular.
Let me go to the other one. Oh, did I not do the question? That's what I do. 4253. There's a method in my slide making, actually.
For the sort of integrity.
That's good. So I guess maybe a culminating question for all this is, in some ways, the ultimate one. It's about death. We're all going to die. You're going to die. You have not so long ago suffered through the loss of your wife. There was a kind of consolation that was available to you when you were a believing Christian.
Right.
What's the closest thing you can find to a substitute for that kind of consolation?
I don't think there is any substitute for it, which is why the abandonment of it is such a radical move. I don't think there's any afterlife. I don't believe in magic. Our consciousness is embedded in the material substratum of our brains. When those neurons stop firing, there's not going to be any more Glenn Loury, just like there isn't any longer a Linda Datcher Loury. This was, actually a critical thing for me, because the difference between thinking that this spirit that is within each of us lives on after our bodies decay and not thinking so it's profound, it's fundamental, it's radical. There is no solace. Death is the end. You perhaps can think about the larger, point of view about life, which is it's not about me, it's about life. And life goes on, but I don't go on. This is my view, and I'm not looking for consolation. I'm looking for the courage to face up to the reality of my own finitude.
Are there ways to lead a life that you think prepare one to confront death before others? Let's say the thought experiment you're going through, and let's imagine that wasn't a self-defeating lifestyle, which it kind of is, because the more you do, the more you need, and pretty soon you don't have a job and you're suffering. So it just doesn't work. But suppose hedonism worked. Suppose you could just take these drugs and they made you feel better, and it was pretty enduring, and you had sex with a series of strangers, and that felt good, and that was your whole life. And then imagine, in contrast, the life you've actually lived since that period, when you did the things you've talked about, helping students along the path toward a productive life, loving your children, and so on. I mean, do you think the prospect of death would be equally bleak regardless, or that you have a right to confront, in some sense you have a right to confront death with more equanimity in one case than the other, or what? Now I'm babbling, so step in and say something.
Well, what I think, I'm contrasting this hedonistic thing with its opposite, and you're asking me whether or not the way one faces death should depend in some way on how it is that one has lived one's life, or do I think so? And I do think so. And this is not going to be a philosophically profound observation, but if we are finite, it doesn't mean that the effect of us having lived is finite. It can echo on, and it can echo on through other people and through what it is that we do with the brief time that we have here. So that if I spent my time in a cubicle experiencing sensations that titillated various areas of my brain and caused me to be, quote, happy, close quote, and then expired, I would have wasted my life. My life would have been no more than the subjective experience of this particular individual for this very brief period of time. Whereas if I had expended my time in an effort to develop my own gifts to their maximal extent, and then to try to share the benefits of those gifts with the world through various institutions and practices, such as the university and being a teacher, being a philanthropist, creating things that didn't exist before as a scientist or whatever, I would feel that this life, which is finite, and the day will come when I have to recognize that it's my last day, should I be lucky enough to be conscious of my own death approaching, I could view that with a little bit, I'm not going to say equanimity. I don't want to die. Nobody wants to die. That's terrible. That's a catastrophe. It's the end of me. But at least I could look at it as saying this brief period was worth more than simply titillating myself. I can't see it. I'm just speaking personally. Again, I'm not saying this is a profound philosophical observation, but I'd be terrified at the prospect of having to regret on my deathbed having wasted 70 or 80 years doing nothing but having a good time, when God imbued me with. I still use that language sometimes, even if I'm not believing in the literal theological claims. I find the language comforting in a way. I'm not responsible for the gifts of intellect and articulateness and whatever insight I might have as a scholar and as a writer and a person. I'm not personally responsible for that. So I want to give, as it were, credit where credit is due. So, okay, you can see I'm confused, Bob.
and again, it's just such a lovely interview, and I'm just deeply moved by it. You know, it sort of reminds me of the end of Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs. One Sunday afternoon when he wasn't feeling well, Jobs sat in the garden behind his house and reflected on death. He talked about his experiences in India almost 4 decades earlier, his study of Buddhism, and his views on reincarnation and spiritual transcendence. I'm 50-50 on believing in God, he said. For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence than meets the eye. He admitted that as he faced death. He might be overestimating the odds of a desire to believe in an afterlife. I like to think that something survives after you die, he said. It's strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom and it goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures. He fell silent for a very long time. But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch, he said. Click and you're gone. Then he paused again and smiled slightly. Maybe that's why I never like to put an on-off switch on Apple devices. When I listen to things like this, I ponder the skeptic's thought. Against whom is the crime of belief? Does this violate your pride? Does this betray your community? Does this harm your neighbor? And I think about, I look at this interview and it makes me a little angry. You know, we think everyone's beliefs are formed and are, formed by experience and by, 3.5 billion years of looking at each other or what have you, except ours, my beliefs, mine, are somehow chosen in the pristine, clean room of my own will. Who then is responsible for Glenn's unbelief? And I listened to him wistfully talking about this, and he's not the first person I've heard this from. I've gotten letters from some of you that have expressed very similar things. And I know, often when individuals write me, they'll be very, when I hear Peterson talk about how he's approached, obviously by far, far more people than I am. My experience is similar. Most of you write me in very gracious ways and apologize and tell me I don't need to answer back, and then you'll share stories from your life with me, and it's a sacred thing. It's a holy thing. In many ways, your story is more real than. Real. This gets into my reality talks, obviously, but there are few things closer to who you are than your story, and so when you share your stories with me, you share yourself with me, and some of you have shared how you want to believe but just can't, and I find that sad, and it makes me a little angry. Does his unbelief work for him? And you almost hear him wistfully wishing it didn't. I don't want to put words in his mouth. He expressed himself very well. What does he gain by being unable to believe in anything but the big sleep? Who has robbed him of the potential solace of being reunited with departed loved ones, including his wife? Was it MIT? Is it this context we live in? Is it pride? Is the embroidered fantasy of the stoic and noble atheist refusing such comfort anything less to an atheist than the human made-up stories that they charge religion to be? If in fact our sense of meaning is dependent upon our brain and limited to our brain and goes with us into the abyss when we die, if all of this dies at the end of the universe, what then the difference of how it dies one way or another, and whether someone stands up stoically and nobly and faces their death and says, there's nothing in that hole. Okay, you've got your pride. So what? You've embroidered it. Is it any different from a religious person embroidering their death with all kinds of stories about an imagined afterlife? If that's your position, if you have an atheist position, it's all just made up stories, one way and the other. We say, well, my made up story is true. Well, good for you. There you have it. Embroider away. But it's all the same. And so I'm sympathetic and a bit angry. And I think about Charles Taylor's book that I mentioned in my last video, how the last 500 years in many ways has robbed us as a group. And again, we don't think for ourselves, we think in community, and we're shaped by those around us. And it's very different to resist the beliefs of those that we esteem around us, those that we look up to, those that we want to emulate. We believe in community. There's such a thing as sociology of knowledge. And I loved Glenn Loury's story about going to visit Richard John Newhouse. And if you don't know who he is, look him up on Wikipedia and read some of his stuff. He's a very interesting man who started his career as a Missouri Synod Lutheran and became somewhat radicalized during the civil rights movement, but then became a neocon and a Roman Catholic priest. Fascinating man. And when Glenn tells that story of Richard John Newhouse laughing when poor Glenn is in travail, and Newhouse laughing because I think part of his laughter is a laughter of community and saying, yeah, when you stare into that abyss, it is not easy. To me, to believe in a powerful God is easy. To believe in a good God, that requires revelation. I think Prager said that. Prager said that on his Ben Shapiro Prager show. But there's a lot of truth to that. I'm going to pull something that John Calvin wrote. Ought we not then to be silent about free will? This is from his commentary on Ephesians. And good intentions and fancied preparations and merits and satisfactions? There is none of these which does not claim a share of praise in the salvation of men, so that the praise of grace would not, as Paul shews, remain undiminished. When, on the part of man, the act of receiving salvation is made to consist in faith alone, all other means on which men are accustomed to rely are discarded. Faith then brings a man empty to God, that he might be filled with the blessings of Christ. And so he adds, not of ourselves, that claiming nothing for ourselves, they may acknowledge God alone as the author of their salvation. And the part that I like of this is the things upon which we rely. We rely upon our pride. We rely upon our smarts. We rely upon believing the correct thing. And you'll find, I had a conversation with someone today, and I noted that, he's trying to figure out if he wants to go forward in pursuing a relationship with a church, and it's hard because right now he's in a sense a honeymoon of a new experience of mystery and of faith, but going into a church is a complicated thing, and in a strange sense, you can be a greater sinner in a church than outside of it, because what you do is you appropriate the things of God and you bend them to your will, and then you make them the refuge against God. And you use the gifts of God, and you say, but I had faith in you, but I did works for you. I gave my body to the flames. I gave up all my money. I did all of this, and I did all of this to gain status with you. And John Calvin here says, oh, that's not faith. Faith is looking at all these things that we're accustomed to rely upon. We're accustomed to rely upon our smarts. We're accustomed to rely upon our moral status. We're accustomed to rely upon our good works. We're accustomed to rely upon the fact that we are relatively better than those that we select and look upon as our moral inferiors. We're accustomed to rely upon that, whether that be because they believe less than us or more than us, or they believe the wrong thing, or any of that. And what John Calvin says here is that faith then brings a man and a woman empty to God, where we go to God and we say, well, what is faith? Faith is that it's him, not us. Can you have faith with doubt? We say, I have nothing on my own to rely. What do we have faith in, and what do we have doubt in? Well, we have less faith in ourselves and more doubt in ourselves. I trust more in God's goodness than my own. Noting that this still allows for questions. It is a relative difference. We finally go to God and say, look, I know what I am. I know my limitations. I know how my beliefs are formed. I know that my beliefs are formed. I inherit them from my parents. And as Glenn Loury says, the degree of intelligence I have, I can't take credit for. The education I received, my parents prompted so much of that and got me going down the road. The belief I have, my parents instilled in me. The morality I bring, is, as Nietzsche said, is so often a matter of cowardice and opportunity. There are a million reasons why I'm morally compromised. And so when I go to God, you can even go to God and say, look, I don't even know if I believe in you. I don't even know if you're there. I've got all kinds of doubts about you, but I've got greater doubts about myself. And in a sense, I think that's part of what Calvin calls faith. All these things, which are real, the goodness that we do and the sacrifice, these things are real, but these things that we are accustomed to rely upon are discarded. Faith then brings us empty to God, so we may be filled with the blessings of Christ. And so I listen to Glenn Loury and I think, yeah. And then he can't help but talk about God at the end. And of course, I speak as a Christian, and I speak as someone who believes in this narrative and in this story. And Glenn Loury comes to Christ, and I don't know what he says, but I would hope he'd say, I had doubts. I lived in a time where belief was hard. I pushed away the opportunities I had to serve you or to worship you or to praise you. I surrounded myself with people who were skeptics, and I did all of this, but what I can trust on is your goodness, not mine. And I think about the thief on the cross, who begins at least in Luke, he begins the journey with the other. They weren't really thieves. They were rebels. They were insurgents trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. And then the one thief gets a sense of Jesus, and he basically says, I trust you more than I trust myself. And Jesus says, surely you'll be with me in paradise. I get angry at a world that robs people of that solace facing death. Didn't know I was going to do a video today, but I watched this a couple of days ago, and I thought I wanted to share it. So whatever it's worth, there it is.